In a leafy suburb of Toronto lives one of the world's most controversial thinkers.
Come on in.
Thank you.
Jordan.
Hey. Psychology professor Jordan Peterson caused a storm in late 2016 with a couple of YouTube videos about changes to the law in Canada around gender pronouns.
You came in from where?
I came in from London last night. His university campus became a battleground.
That's assault right there. Officer, I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything that happened.
Like, if I asked you, would you please use they them pronouns for me? What?
It would depend on
what hoops do you want us to jump through?
Those are my pronouns. Those are my
There's
pronouns.
no motivation.
No, I know. No one ever has any motivation.
His opponents accused him of being transphobic. Many others rallied to support him. His job was threatened, but he refused to back down. He claimed that the new law pushed forward an authoritarian political agenda.
I was being asked, as everyone is, to use a certain set of words that I think are the constructions of people who have a political ideology that I don't believe in and that I also regard as dangerous. To me, they're an attempt to control language and in a direction that isn't happening organically, it's not happening naturally, but by force and by fiat. And I would say by force because there's legislative power behind them. So and I don't like these made-up words, Z and Zer and that sort of thing.
Okay, what about... For Peterson, this wasn't really about pronouns. This was a surface reflection of a much deeper crisis.
Not smiling, bitch. What you want?
The legislation itself and the policies were signifying a crisis, a disjunction in Western society that was far, of which the gender pronoun argument was only a tiny tendril. I put my finger on a nerve.
As time passed, many of those who flocked to his videos for an attack on political correctness became hooked by his message of transformation and transcendence, and began calling him one of the most profound thinkers of the time. As a journalist and filmmaker for TV networks like Channel 4 and the BBC, I'm trained to be sceptical of these kind of grand claims. But over the last few months of listening to his lectures, I've become convinced that what he is saying is that significant, which is why I've come all the way to Toronto to interview him. Peterson has been studying belief systems his whole life, and how the most utopian ideas can create the worst outcomes. And he's concluded that only appreciation and integration of the great ideas of the past would protect us from the same things happening again.
I've always been surprised that I've been able to teach what I've been teaching in the universities, because I've always regarded it as crazily radical in a sense, you know. It's crazily radical in a conservative way. I don't know what to make of that.
Your teaching is crazily radical?
In a conservative way, yeah. I mean, it's in a conservative way because I think that the past is not only has value, we cannot live without the integration of the past. No more than you can live as an individual without integrating your past. I mean, we're historical creatures, right? And without, if we're not united consciously with the past, then we're divided internally and socially, and that has consequences. So some of them are playing themselves out in the political divisions in the current world. But the consequences can be fatal.
His fascination with the nature of belief systems started when he was a young man, haunted by the threat of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War.
I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly.
He believes the answers for how to live properly are all around us if we look carefully.
The artists get there before the philosophers, long before the philosophers. The dramatists get there way before the artists even. And so we figured it out. We represented it in art and literature and music and drama, and then we're on the cusp, so to speak, of understanding it in a fully articulated manner, and not a moment too soon.
So what is that idea? Basically that there's a hidden story of transformation and transcendence, and it's encoded in our mythology, in our religion, in our biology, and in our actions.
Peterson is reviving the thought of Carl Jung, the renegade psychologist who delved deeply into the human subconscious to develop the theory of archetypes, universal patterns of being such as the Divine Mother or the hero, shared by all in the collective unconscious.
The way it looks to me is that we embody a lot of information in our action, right? And our action has developed as a consequence of imitating other people. And not only the people around us, but of course the people around us imitated the people who came before them, and those people imitated the people who came before them, and so on, so far back that it's as far back as you can go. And so you embody these patterns of behavior that are extremely informative, that you don't understand, that are a consequence of collective imitation across the centuries. And so then those patterns can become manifest as figures of the imagination. And those figures of imagination are the distillations of patterns of behavior. And so as the distillations of patterns of behavior, they have content. And it's not you, that content. You could even think about it as content that's evolved, although it's culturally transmitted. It's content that's evolved. And so these figures of the imagination can reveal the structure of reality to you. And that's what happened with Jung, and that's what he described in the Red Book, and that was what permeated his psychology, a psychology that was based on the presupposition that the fundamental archetypal structures of religious belief were not pathological, not deceitful, not protective in some delusional sense against the fear of death, but quite the contrary. The very stories that enabled us to move forward as confident human beings in the face of chaos itself. And it's conceivable, I think perhaps probable, that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that. Because it was the first time post-Enlightenment that a rapprochement between the intellect and the underlying religious archetypal substructure occurred. You have in the capacious intellect of Jung, and the same thing happened to some degree with Piaget, the religious domain and the factual domain were brought back together. And the fact of Jung's enduring and increasing popularity and influence, I would say, is a direct consequence of that.
Peterson is reviving Jung and grounding his discoveries in the latest neuroscience, explaining how these mythological archetypes are encoded in our brains and bodies, tying together mythology, psychology, morality, and religion with science.
You're adrift without it. You have to have a conscious relationship with the archetypes. Yeah. There's no way, if you don't, then you're susceptible to possession. That's basically, or to despair. Yeah. So, and no wonder.
Well, you've got to have axioms. So the right
Yes.
axioms are the archetypes.
Yes, that's why they exist.
So do you see archetypes as biological structures?
They're at least that. Yeah, they're pre-existing categories of perception. In the Kantian sense, that's a good way of thinking about it, is that, you know, the pure empiricist thinks that you get all your information from the outside world, right? But that's not true, because you bring an a priori interpretive framework to the world. Yeah. And that's instantiated biologically, but then it's also enculturated. So separating the archetype from the underlying biological reality isn't easy. So you have this snake, you have the propensity to perceive reptilian predators. The manner in which those things are represented in the culture fill those holes, essentially. And so that can
In the
take
same
a
way as the
variety of
language
different
instinct
forms.
fills
Yeah,
in.
that's right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Like the archetypes are manifestations of the universal grammar of emotion and motivation. That's a good way of thinking about it. Now, they may be more than that.
Peterson thinks we have to recover these timeless truths, but most of all, the idea of transcendental truth itself, the Logos.
There's a principle at the heart of Western civilization, and it's older than Christianity, and it's older than Judaism, although both Judaism and Christianity developed it to a great degree. It's the idea of the Logos, and the Logos is also the root word of logic, but Logos means something like coherent, interpersonal communication of the truth, and from an archetypal perspective, it's the action of the Logos that extracts order from chaos. It's the fundamental proposition of Western culture, and we've lost it, and we will not survive without it. The West will die without the rebirth of the Logos, because the West is that. So, with that gone, it's gone. And we've seen what's arisen to replace it. Well, there's fascism, there's communism, and then there's the New Age mess, because it's a mess. And most of it's wish fulfillment and fantasy and inability to, there's creativity in it, but there's no capacity to edit whatsoever. There's no coherence. And so that stuff's so weak that anyone with any commitment can just push it aside. And there's no justification for the Marxism or for the fascism. It's like we already had that experiment.
Could you describe what you mean by the rebirth of the Logos then, in that context?
Well, it's part of it is taking voluntary responsibility for the appalling conditions of your life, essentially, that you're a suffering creature that's mortal, right? And that you're the locus of evil, both of those things. And that it's your response, that your life is about responsibility, and it's your responsibility to voluntarily accept that, and then to do what you can about it. Even though it's, in some sense, it's an enterprise doomed to failure in some sense, because you're going to die, and the world is a carnage, a place of carnage. But that you can accept that. And if you can't accept it, then what that means is that you're not integrated enough. Because if you're integrated enough, then you can accept it. It's like the test of the integration. So your character isn't forged sufficiently if you cannot tolerate that. And it's not like it's an easy thing to tolerate. Often what people do is they just don't think about it. They just push it out of their mind. And no wonder. But they pay for that with shallowness and with self-contempt and with the inability to bear suffering nobly, let's say. There's a call to nobility in the idea of imitation of the Logos. But it's more than that. It's a call to something of, well, the hypothesis is it's a call to something of cosmic significance. And I don't think that we have any right to assume that that idea is wrong. We don't understand our place in the cosmos. And if you base your analysis on size, physical size, well, there are bigger things than us. But that's not a reasonable yardstick. There isn't anything that's more complex than us, not that we know of. So why not use that as a marker?
Peterson is often characterised as a religious conservative, but the core of his message has echoes of a radical belief that organised Christianity has fought against for generations, often called the Gnostic heresy, the idea that we can become like Jesus.
The question is, what happens to the world around you as you increasingly embody the Logos? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what the ultimate level of this. Now, the hypothesis is, and it's a hypothesis that extends to some degree to Buddha as well, the hypothesis is that there has been one or two individuals who managed that, and that in their management of that, they transcended death itself. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible.
There's a few quotes that I transcribed that from the Ideology, Logos and Belief lecture, which I remember having a kind of hair stand up on the back of my neck moment when I heard you say this. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. That's mysticism rather than religion, is it not?
Well, I don't know if you can draw a distinction between those two things to some degree, because you could say that in a religious system there's two components, and people are temperamentally inclined to align with one or the other. There's a dogmatic component, so the conservatives are more likely to align with that, and there's a active mystical component which updates the conservative component but also threatens it, so which is what creative thought does in general. And so I would say that the mystical element of that is religious, but it's more on the transformative side. But I also think that figures like the Buddha, he's an exemplar of the possibilities of that alignment. And the exercises, the yogic exercises, for example, are attempts to bring that alignment into being. It's very centered on the body, which is quite interesting, even though it's a spiritual tradition, right? It's very, very centered on the body.
And when you say you have intimations of what that might mean, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I've had experiences where everything came together, and they're very, very powerful experiences, and they're also characterized by, it's like everything turns into a musical symphony where each part is exactly appropriate for that moment. And I think music actually expresses that, which is partly why music produces transcendent experiences. When people are dancing to something profound and they're really into it, let's say, the music and the person are the same thing. And then if things really get going, you see this sometimes in a rock concert or a musical concert where everyone is in the same place, right? The band kicks into high gear and they're way out beyond where they usually go. You don't see that often in a concert, even a great concert, but now and then you really see it. And the whole place is one thing. It's just pulsing, and that's an amazing experience. And I think it is an intimation of paradise. It's something like that. And you can think about that psychologically, because it also makes sense psychologically that we're at our best when we're integrated completely. And there's an effect of that integration in principle on what we would normally regard as external reality, because external reality can line up with that integration as well, and so-called external reality. And I think people probably experience that when they have peak sexual experiences with someone, where there's real intimacy because they're in the same place at the same time and everything comes together for that moment,
Maybe literally.
Yes, literally, right. And I also don't think that linguistic usage is chance, right? Because I think that's a place where that experience is a brief intimation of heaven. That might be a way of thinking about it. So,
this message of responsibility and meaning is resonating most deeply with men.
Every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly? And then the other thing I've noticed is that I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody conversation. What are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility, because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, Well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You know, you're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look at, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. And that's very, like I've seen that phenomenon because I've been talking about this mythological material for a long time. And I can see when I'm watching crowds, people, you know, their eyebrows lift, their eyes light up because I put something together for them. And that's what mythological stories do. So I'm not taking responsibility for that. That's what the stories do. So I say the story and people go click, 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 you know, and their eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable. It just blows me away. It's like, really? That's the counterculture. Grow the hell up and do something useful. Really? I could do that? Oh, I'm so excited by that idea. No one ever mentioned that before. It's like rights, 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 rights. Jesus, it's appalling. And I feel that that's deeply felt by the people who are coming out to listen to these sorts of things too. They've had enough of that. So, and they better have, because it's a non-productive mode of being. Responsibility, man. I think it's because in a deep level, the West has lost faith in the idea of masculinity. And that's no different than the death of God. It's the same thing. And Nietzsche knew what the consequence of that would be. I mean, that's most of what he wrote about, you know, and so you'd say, well, the divine symbol of masculinity has been obliterated. Well, so then what do you expect? What's going to happen? That means masculinity is going to become weak. And especially if the symbol is also denigrated, right? Which it definitely is. So what that means is that the ideal that man could aspire to is denigrated. And, well, then with your ideal in tatters, you're weak. That's definitional. So I think the reason that men have been responding positively to my thinking, let's say, is that I don't buy any of that. I like the masculine spirit. It's necessary, and it's not fundamentally carnage and pillaging. It's not fundamentally rape culture. You know, it's not fundamentally world destroying. And all of those things all of those aspersions have been cast upon it. That's partly the guilt of Western society for technological progress, even. And those are reasonable challenges to be set before men. But they're not reasonable accusations to swallow without criticism. And
it's not that. What is it? What is a masculinity we can aspire to?
Well, it's responsibility fundamentally, and it's to put it symbolically, is that your responsibility is to incarnate the spirit of the Logos. That's your responsibility. That's your role in life, and that is independent to some degree in whether or not you accept the idea of a transcendent and eternal reality. Now, I'm not making a case for that or against that. Those things are beyond human understanding. But we know what happens if people act poorly, if men act badly. We know what happens. We know that the world turns into something that's so close to hell that the difference is trivial. We know that. That's the story of the 20th century. So we should learn that lesson. And what that lesson is pick up the world on your shoulders and walk forward. Pick up the world with all of its trouble, with all of its suffering, with all of its evil, and move forward with it. And in bearing that burden, learn that you're the sort of creature that can bear that burden and therefore deserving of respect. That's identification with the logos, and I've never encountered an idea that's better than that, because it's so not naive. It's the opposite of naive. It's like there's terrible evil and there's terrible suffering. It's bottomless. But the human spirit is capable of voluntarily taking that on as a challenge. Well, it's worth a try.
He believes this deep evolved truth is under attack by a timeless resentment, relativism and cynicism, under the modern guise of the philosophy of postmodernism.
People don't understand that postmodernism is a complete assault on two things. One, it's an assault on the metaphysical substrate of our culture, and I would say that the metaphysical substrate looks something like a religious substrate, so it's a direct assault on that. And the second thing it's an assault on is everything that's been established since the Enlightenment. Rationality, empiricism, science, everything. Clarity of mind, dialogue, the idea of the individual, all of that is not only, you see, it's not only that it's up for grabs. That's not the thing. It's to be destroyed.
He believes that postmodernism was the hidden motivation for the pronoun law and is an attack on the core structures of being itself.
I assume that you're sceptical of the idea of the description of gender as a spectrum.
No, I'm suspicious of the motives for putting that idea forward. And I also think it's an imprecise definition. It's not a spectrum, because a spectrum is equally represented at each point in the distribution. So that's wrong. And it's wrong in the way that you would expect it to be wrong given its ideological basis. Now, you know, there's male and female and masculine and feminine are not exactly the same thing. And that's a reasonable claim. And you could also make a case that too much masculinity without an admixture of femininity is a form of excess, and that too much femininity without an admixture of masculinity is an excess, you know, or is a failure. It's an extreme. But the obliteration of the distinction between male and female or masculine and feminine it's a psychological catastrophe, not least because those are arguably the most basic cognitive axioms. They're deeper than that. They're axioms on which our entire cognitive structure is predicated. And
yin yang.
Yes, exactly. Well, and I think that that's a consequence of our biological heritage, like the reality of sex. Sex is very, very, very old. It's a fundamental issue, and sex is fundamentally about female and male, and there's no getting around that. Now, as I said, you can distinguish masculine and feminine from that, and you can speak about the psychological components of sex as well as the physiological components, but the real radicals deny the physiological components. It's like, that's okay, except when they force other people to do the same kind of denial. Like, people are entitled to their opinion, but they're not entitled to put it in the law. And so that's why I was opposed to, not to transgender rights or to transgender people, or, I mean, that's a sideshow in many ways. I'm not trying to trivialize it, but it's not the main event. It's emblematic of something else. Otherwise, no one would have cared. And I just see it as fundamentally oriented towards destabilization and destruction.
He says to defend ourselves against resentment, we each need to identify it in ourselves, our shadows.
And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.
Well, through listening to it, it started to make sense of a lot of what I've been doing over the last few years. I've done quite a lot of sort of deep transformational practices, a lot of shadow work, so integrating the shadow, and actually feeling that real sense of becoming more in alignment with myself, feeling that these different parts of myself coming together and feeling more embodied and more present in the world. But it was through listening to you that I made this connection with the Logos, with the idea that this is actually a deep principle of Western culture, which gave it another...
It's the principle of the incarnation, right? Because the incarnation is at least a symbolic representation of the idea that the spirit has to fully inhabit the body, right? And that's also a remarkable idea, especially because the spirit, so to speak, the psyche, if you want, flees from the body in terror, because the body is the place of mortality and suffering. And so people are disembodied, and it's because, one way of looking at it is because they're too afraid to become fully embodied. And it's no wonder they're afraid. There's reason to be afraid, but the question is, well, what would you be like if you had the courage to be fully embodied? And that's fully incarnate. That's another way of thinking about that. And the idea, the Christian idea, is that the fully incarnate human being is the Messiah. That's the idea. That's a hell of an idea, but it means embracing the horrors of the world. That's what it means. And that's not only the horrors of the world, but the evil of the world, So there's this idea that Christ took the individual. Absolutely. Well, then those are not different. And there's this idea that not only was Christ the incarnate spirit, right, so fully descended into the body, let's say, but that he also took the sins of the world onto himself. And what that means is that, psychologically speaking, is that part of spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you, and to fully wrestle with them and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away, it's to transmute them. And you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well, because they get taken advantage of. And someone who's integrated that more, they're dangerous in the martial arts sort of way, which is they're dangerous, but they don't have to use it, because their presence radiates, what would you say? It doesn't radiate threat exactly. Well, certainly strength, but it's the potential for havoc. That's the right way of thinking about it. There's an implicit potential for havoc, and that's really necessary. It's one of the things that gives people self-respect. This is an interesting thing about the integration of the shadow, because recognizing yourself as the locus of evil, let's say, actually, in some sense, gives you far more respect for yourself, strangely enough, because the same respect that you might have for a wild animal or even a monster. It's like, so then maybe you learn to treat yourself differently. Like, I think this is particularly true with regards to the discipline of children. If you know that you're a monster, and that will manifest itself in your life, consciously or unconsciously, and if it's unconsciously, it's not good, then you become better at disciplining children. And the reason for that is that you don't want to expose them to your dark side. And so if they behave and don't provoke you, which means they'll also behave for other people, then the monstrous part can stay in abeyance, and then that's great. But if you don't understand yourself as capable of wreaking havoc, and that can be the kind of havoc that unfolds over decades, right? Because if you're going to abuse a child, it's the primitive form of abuse is the physical abuse. The sophisticated form of abuse is the continual undermining of the child's courage across perhaps their entire life. And there's a terribly monstrous element to that. And if you're not respected properly by the child, say, you will absolutely take revenge on them. And, that's the whole, in some sense, that's the whole Freudian psychoanalytic story. It's not all of it, but it's a huge part of it. So,
interesting that you say that you have to accept the fact that you're dangerous or become dangerous, because I'd also say that if you haven't done that kind of shadow work, if you haven't made friends with your anger, if you haven't integrated it, you're actually more dangerous.
Yes, definitely.
Because then things will happen it will come out in a way that you don't expect.
Right, it comes out disintegrated. So it comes out as an autonomous spirit, right, under no one's control. And that's like a burst of rage, let's say. You either have that or it has you. Those are the options. Yeah. And you don't become safe by being castrated, right? That's not the right move forward. You can actually see a change in people's faces when that part of them is integrated, when I would say the rage circuit is integrated, because their faces harden. Like they no longer look like wide-eyed children, that they're no longer someone to whom things only happen. They're someone who makes things happen. And there isn't much difference between being dangerous and being indomitable, right? They're the same thing looked at from two different perspectives. And so, in my new book, I wrote a little bit about, there was an idea in the 80s that was reasonably popular among psychologists, that the way to regulate male aggression was to socialize little boys like little girls. And that's a very, very bad idea. So, because suppressing that aggressive, competitive urge, which also characterizes many women, by the way, although it's more common among men, that isn't what you do. You integrate it. This is why I'm such a fan of Piaget, not as opposed to Freud, but I think Piaget's developmental model is superior to Freud's developmental model, because for Piaget, the process of becoming civilized is a process of continual integration, including the integration of what Freud would consider the id. It's not as if Freud didn't know that, because he wanted people to incorporate the id, but he kind of conceptualized socialization as the superego inhibiting the id, or suppressing it. That only happens when the socialization process is bad. When it's good, like if you have a competitive child, like my son was and is a competitive person, you have them integrate that into the ethos of fair play. And then it's a mark of character strength at that point. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it.
For Peterson, this shadow work is another process of embodying the Logos in our own lives by speaking the truth.
If you listen to yourself talk, you can tell when you're speaking properly, you will experience a feeling of integration and strength, and when you're speaking in a deceitful or manipulative manner, you'll feel that you're starting to come apart at the seams. And what you need to do is practice only saying things that make you feel stronger. The truth is something that burns. It burns off dead wood. And people don't like having their dead wood burnt off, often because they're like 95% dead wood. And believe me, I'm not being snide about that. It's no joke. When you start to realize how much of what you've constructed of yourself is based on deception and lies, that is a horrifying realization. And it can easily be 95% of you. Things you say, things you act out.
Many describe how listening to him is a process of integrating things they knew, but didn't know that they knew.
That's another hallmark of truth. is that it snaps things together. And people write to me all the time and say that. It's as if things were coming together in my mind. It's like, well, that's what archetypes do. Right. Archetypes glue things together. So yes, it's the proper expression of unconscious being teaches people what they already know. It's kind of like the Platonic idea that all learning was remembering. It's right. It's not right exactly the way that we would think of learning and remembering now, but you have a nature, and when you feel that nature articulated, it's
like the act of snapping the puzzle pieces together.
Yes.
They're right there.
Yes, well, that's the bringing the levels of being into synchrony. That's what you feel. It's like, oh, that's synchronized now. It's like what I think and the way I feel have come together. And you feel that snap. It's like, oh, it's a simpler state. It's something like that. It's not rife with contradictions anymore.
Since he came to public attention, Peterson has been doing the seemingly impossible, convincing hardened atheists of the value of religion. He's a scientist, but not a materialist, and criticises the likes of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris.
This is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue? Why the hell not every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost? It's a perfectly coherent philosophy. And it's actually one that you can institute in the world with a fair bit of material success if you want to do it. So I don't see. To me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. The ethic that you think is normative is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic. To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality. Now, you could say that's a transcendent morality instantiated in the figure of God. That's fine. You could even call that a personification of the morality. If you don't want to move into a metaphysical space, I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact mid-air without any foundational support.
For Peterson, wisdom emerges from a much deeper place than the rational intellect.
I don't consider myself an intellectual precisely.
What do you consider yourself?
See, because my ideas aren't disembodied. I act them out.
But to be an intellectual...
It kind of makes me a romantic in some sense. Well, I don't live in my head exactly. Many of the prominent intellectual types have become prisoners of their own imagination. You know, and this is partly what breeds that terror of intellectualism. There's something about it that's... We don't want to get too far away from our bodies. We don't want to get too far away from our souls. That's another way of thinking about it. And, you know, there is this idea that, as I said before, that the Catholics always warned about is that the rational mind falls in love with its own productions, or even more, that it tries to elevate its productions to the status of God.
What are the prerequisites for true knowledge and understanding? Because it seems to me that intelligence is only a small matter of seeing and understanding properly, and it takes a certain amount of moral courage. It takes a certain amount of having done the work of introspection, having done the work of deep introspection. What do you think the components are for true knowledge and understanding?
Well, I think the motivation, one of the best motivations, is existential terror. You know, I mean, I don't remember where this is in the Old Testament, but the line is, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And that's definitely psychologically true, but we could strip it, say, of its transcendent implications and say, well, if, for me anyways, I wasn't motivated to be serious until I knew what I was capable of in the most negative way. Because you don't take yourself seriously until you know that you are an evil monster. And you don't take that seriously until you know what that means. And so, but once you know what that means, especially if you do it, if you find that out consciously, say, then you're in a position to start taking yourself seriously enough so that you might be willing to learn what you need to learn to become wise. You have to see yourself as an Auschwitz camp guard, and you have to see yourself enjoying it. And that can't just be an exercise in intellectual simulation, precisely. It has to be a dramatic experience. You have to feel that in your bones. And then you have to decide, and you have to give the devil his due. There's something very attractive about predatory power. And you might even say that it's preferable to pathetic weakness. Now, I'm not saying that, but you could make a case that it is. Because you could say that the person who's pathetically weak would like to be a predatory tyrant, but just doesn't have the ability. And that's a Nietzschean criticism of standard morality, I would say. But then, is there something higher than predatory power? Well, yes. I mean, part of Christ's encounter with Satan in the desert is precisely that realization, because he's offered the kingdom of the world. And that means he's offered the option of tyrannical power. And his response to that is, there's something better. And that's wisdom. There is something better. And there's no reason not to go for what is the best. What else? You don't have anything better to do than that by definition, right? So why not work for the betterment of being and abandon your resentment and your hatred of humanity and your self-contempt and take on the responsibility of the horrors and catastrophes of human existence, and do what you can to, well, at least not make it worse, but maybe to make it better. You know you can. You know you can make it worse and better. You just don't know how much. Find out. It might be way more than you think. I'm sure that's the case. So there isn't any more interesting adventure than that. You know, find out how much good you can do in the world, and not in this moralistic thou shalt not way, but in a forthright, noble, courageous, eyes wide open, articulate, embodied manner. And then God only knows where we could get. So
let's see.
Let's find out. That would be good. It's certainly better than the alternative.
For the full 90-minute interview with Jordan Peterson and more documentaries and interviews about the biggest ideas, check out the Rebel Wisdom website. We're also running workshops for men to give a direct experience of transformation, integration, and purpose. Thank you for watching.